The notion that the 2020 election was the most secure election in American history, well, that came from this agency right here, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, CISA. This is a sub-agency sitting underneath the Department of Homeland Security, and they're the ones who released that famous assessment, which was of course then echoed out by the mainstream legacy news outlets across the whole country. However, new details have been uncovered exposing how, long before they issued that now famous statement, well, the government agents within CISA, they were suppressing and censoring American citizens' concern over the security of mail-in ballots, despite the fact that those same agents within CISA, they knew that there were real security issues. Specifically, internal government documents, which were first obtained by America First Legal, they appear to show that ahead of the 2020 election, there was a big disconnect between what the bureaucrats over at CISA privately acknowledged versus what they did and what they said publicly. Quote, America First Legal released new documents from its lawsuit against the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency for records from its mis, dis, and malinformation team regarding the 2020 election. The new documents reveal that CISA knew mail-in and absentee voting are less secure than in-person voting, confirming warnings by former President Trump and others of increased fraud, and shared these concerns with mainstream media outlets during an unclassified media tour the Friday before the 2020 election. However, the mainstream media, having derided the notion that vote by mail was less secure than in-person voting, covered up the truth. CISA also knew that there was no credible evidence to support the claim that in-person voting would spread COVID-19, yet it covered up the truth and supported mass vote-by-mail schemes. CISA then also relied upon Deloitte, an accounting and consulting firm, to gather disinformation narratives regarding vote-by-mail across social media for the purpose of monitoring and censorship. Now, reading through these actual internal documents, it appears that the conclusion had to be that mail-in voting was safe and secure, no matter what the evidence said to the contrary. For example, this email right here that you can see up on your screen was an exchange from September of 2020, just 2 months before the actual election. And this exchange, it lists out a number of problems with mail-in voting, including, quote, high numbers of improperly completed ballots and the shortage of personnel to process ballots in a prompt manner. And also in that very same email, the sender, which is an agent within CISA, he or she links to a study which disputes the idea that voting in person contributes to the spread of COVID, which of course was one of the main public reasons that mail-in voting was being pushed so hard in order to prevent the spread of COVID by having people vote in person. And yet, despite their awareness of the inherent risks of mail-in voting, as well as the fact that voting in person was safe, well, this agency, they continued to support the implementation of mass mail-in voting across the whole country. But it gets even deeper than that, because according to this document right here from October of 2020, the depth of CISA's understanding of the dangers of mail-in voting, well, it was rather significant. Because in this particular document, they laid out the 6 significant risks of fraud that are present in mail-in voting schemes. And these significant risks were as followed. Again, this is from CISA's own internal documents. Quote, implementation of mail-in voting infrastructure and processes within a compressed timeline may also introduce new risk. For mail-in voting, some of the risk under the control of election officials during in-person voting shifts to outside entities, such as ballot printers, mail processing facilities, and the United States Postal Service. Integrity attacks on voter registration data and systems represent a comparatively higher risk in a mail-in voting environment when compared to an in-person voting environment. The outbound and inbound processing of mail-in ballots introduces additional infrastructure and technology, increasing potential scalability of cyber attacks. Inbound mail-in ballot processes and tabulation take longer than in-person processing, causing tabulation of results to occur more slowly and resulting in more ballots to tabulate following election night. This disinformation risk to mail-in voting infrastructure and processes is similar to that of in-person voting while utilizing different content. Threat actors may leverage limited understanding regarding mail-in voting processes to mislead and confuse the public. Now that right there is quite ironic, given the fact that on the one hand, this agency is saying that implementing mass mail-in voting in a compressed timeline is their top risk, but on the other hand, that was exactly what was happening in states across the country at that very moment. And that was also exactly what people were censored for daring to criticize. And it's right there that the documents begin to expose some of the more dystopian machinations that were playing themselves out behind the scenes, out of view. That's because about 4 or 5 short days before the actual 2020 election, CISA shared all their findings in what they called a classified media tour. This was when they invited representatives from the legacy mainstream news outlets to come in for a presentation. And according to the internal government documents, among the things that were presented were 2 infographics, which were outlining the election infrastructure cyber risk, as well as the mail-in voting risk. However, instead of just doing straight reporting on the matter by saying that there are risks associated with mail-in ballots, well, most media outlets, they chose to spin it and focus on how statements from the CISA director, Mr. Chris Krebs, contradicted some of what President Trump was saying regarding the security of mail-in ballots. For instance, here's an excerpt from the Washington Post. It's an article that came out just around that period of time. Quote, "Officials, including Krebs, have also scrupulously avoided criticizing or even explicitly correcting Trump's unfounded attacks on the election's legitimacy, even as their own assessments often directly contradict his statements about the security of mail ballots and other topics. Yet CISA is promoting a rumor control webpage that knocks back false claims about election security, including claims that the president has made frequently. The site warns, for example, that safeguards are in place to prevent home-printed or photocopied mail-in ballots from being counted, contradicting claims by both Trump and Barr that foreign powers could manipulate an election by printing phony ballots." But the irony here is that what they wrote is technically true, but it doesn't present the real risks that CISA was acknowledging mail-in balloting to have. However, it wasn't enough to have the mainstream media run interference and to dismiss any problems with mail-in voting just in and of themselves. Instead, CISA itself, as a sub-agency of the Department of Homeland Security, they were monitoring and censoring the discourse of American citizens regarding this particular topic. Quote, "Of all the risks it identified, CISA appeared to focus by far the most on monitoring and censoring the mail-in voting risk narrative. CISA apparently contracted Deloitte to report on daily social media trends relating to the U.S. election, including narratives related to vote by mail, and to flag specific social media posts for CISA's awareness and attention." And what's really interesting is that this trove of internal government documents, it actually includes copies of the reports that were submitted by Deloitte to this agency. You can see them up on your screen right now. And as you can see, they were tracking the amount of people that were discussing things like voter suppression, political exploitation of COVID, as well as the dangers of voting by mail. And besides just tracking the number of people who were discussing these particular topics, well, they were also tracking the sentiment, whether it was trending to be more positive or more negative, with several observations being noted in the right-hand column, such as when President Trump wrote that there were, quote, "big problems and discrepancies with mail-in ballots," when a, quote, "conservative online activist claimed that Twitter is censoring his tweets about voter fraud to help the Democratic presidential nominee," or when, quote, "a conservative online activist accused Twitter of censoring her post about voter fraud that she is witnessing here in Nevada, and expressed her frustrations with Twitter's disclaimers stating that mail-in ballots are secure." And the massive irony here is that these reports from Deloitte were providing feedback to CISA, confirming that their social media censorship campaign was actually working. That's because the censorship on Twitter that these users claim to have experienced, well, it appeared to have been orchestrated by CISA itself. And we only know this because the states of Missouri and Louisiana, they're currently engaged in a free speech lawsuit where these facts are only now beginning to come to light some 4 years later. Quote, "In Missouri versus Biden, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit found that the platform's censorship decisions were made under policies that CISA had pressured them into adopting and based on CISA's determination of the veracity of the flagged information." Furthermore, the House Judiciary Committee and its select subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government, they found that CISA formed something known as the EIP, the Election Integrity Partnership, to censor the free speech not of foreign nationals, but of American citizens. Specifically, while testifying in front of Congress, CISA Director Mr. Chris Krebs, he said that because narratives are narratives, they didn't differentiate between domestic and foreign activity on social media, meaning that within the context of CISA's rumor control initiative, they treated social media activity the same, no matter whether it was posted by American citizens or by foreign nationals in a different country. Here's in fact an excerpt from a congressional exchange between a congressman and Mr. Chris Krebs. Quote, "Question, when did these discussions regarding domestic influence first start? Answer, I don't recall. Question, okay, were they ongoing by the beginning of 2020? Answer, again, I don't recall the moment in time or the periods of time within which we were thinking about the distinction between domestic and foreign interference. Again, I think this gets to, as we ultimately saw with rumor control, narratives are narratives, and we're providing explanation on how the things actually work. So again, it would not matter if it was foreign or domestic for the context, again, of rumor control." The House Judiciary Committee then went on to write the following in their report regarding how CISA targeted entire narratives for censorship. Quote, CISA knew that flagging individual posts for removal would not be sufficient to achieve its goal of categorically censoring disfavored viewpoints, primarily conservative political speech. Instead, entire narratives needed to be targeted for censorship. Pursuant to multiple subpoenas, the committee and select subcommittee obtained communications between CISA, the EIP, and the CIS demonstrating that the true objective in flagging content to social media platforms was to censor entire narratives, not just specific flag posts. However, this does not stop the EIP from identifying massive amounts of social media posts allegedly spreading quote-unquote misinformation, with some misinformation reports containing over 500 individual links. And indeed, this was something that CISA apparently wasn't even hiding. That's because in their actual report, CISA's EIP, their Election Integrity Partnership, they actually bragged about the scope of their efforts. Quote, in the EIP's report touting the scope of its efforts, the EIP found that in the lead-up to the 2020 election, misinformation centered on mail-in voting. Accordingly, EIP collaborators, including CISA, submitted tickets to flag social media posts relating to mail-in voting, with the number of tickets being represented by the graph that you can see up on your screen, and indeed being significantly high in the lead-up to the 2020 election. And so this is the picture that has now taken shape in regards to these documents. Internally, CISA was well aware of the risks and dangers associated with mail-in voting. We know this through the internal government documents, which show that that's exactly what they were discussing in the lead-up to the election. CISA was also apparently well aware that in-person voting did not increase the risk of spreading COVID. However, despite these two facts, CISA continued to encourage and to support the adoption of mass mail-in voting across the whole country, and then, subsequently, they went ahead. They formed the EIP, the Election Integrity Partnership, to censor American citizens who dared to criticize the inherent risks of mail-in voting, risks that they knew about. CISA then subsequently monitored online social media activity, and they flagged unapproved narratives, making sure to then confirm and follow up with the social media companies to make sure that they were adequately censoring these people. Now, I don't know what the technical textbook definition of dystopian government censorship actually is, but after reading through these documents, well, it would appear that what took place here in this agency, well, it might fit the bill pretty closely. If you'd like to go through the entirety of the internal government documents that were uncovered by America First Legal, I'll throw a link to all of them. You can find it down in the description box below this video if you're the type of person that likes to dig into the weeds. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed. Most importantly, stay free.